Late at night, when the house goes still, you hear it, a high-pitched tone that was absent at 30 and present every night at 60, thin, persistent, always at the same pitch. Louder when the house falls silent, invisible when the television is on, present in every quiet moment between conversations, between songs, between the last sounds of the day and the first sounds of the morning. You know the pitch. You could hum it. You have heard it so many times that it has become the sound of silence itself. You have assumed something inside your ear is producing the sound, a damaged component vibrating at a frequency it should not, a nerve misfiring, a mechanical fault generating a signal that arrives at the brain uninvited. Your brain is manufacturing the sound, a phantom signal generated to fill a silence the auditory cortex was never designed to experience. The physics of how the ear separates sound into frequencies, how the cells that detect those frequencies die without replacement, and how the brain responds when an entire frequency band goes permanently silent is the sequence this follows, from the cochlea to the cortex to the phantom. Your ear does not hear sound the way a microphone records it. A microphone captures the combined pressure wave and stores it as a single waveform, every instrument, every voice, every noise flattened into one signal. Your ear does something far more precise. It decomposes every incoming sound into its individual frequency components and delivers each one separately to the brain. A violin and a trumpet playing a single note arrive at your ear as one combined pressure wave. By the time the signal reaches the auditory nerve, the ear has separated them into distinct frequency channels, each reporting independently. You hear both instruments simultaneously and distinctly because the ear performed the separation before the brain received the input. The separation happens in the first milliseconds after the sound arrives, before any conscious processing begins. The mechanism that accomplishes this decomposition is a ribbon of tissue running the length of a snail-shaped chamber called the cochlea, and it does so through pure mechanics. Now, the basilar membrane runs approximately 35 millimeters when the cochlea is mentally uncoiled into a straight tube. The membrane is tapered, stiff, and narrow at the base near the entrance, flexible and wide at the apex at the far end. The stiffness varies by a factor of approximately 100 from base to apex, and this gradient is what makes the frequency separation possible. High-frequency waves, which oscillate rapidly, resonate with stiff structures. Low-frequency waves, which oscillate slowly, resonate with flexible structures. The gradient maps the full audible spectrum onto 35 millimeters of tissue, each frequency assigned to a specific physical location by the mechanics of resonance alone. Sound enters the cochlea as a pressure wave in the perilymph fluid filling the chamber. The wave travels along a membrane as a pattern von Beckezy demonstrated in his Nobel Prize research in 1961, a traveling wave that rises in amplitude as it approaches the position where the membrane's local stiffness matches the incoming frequency. At that resonance point, the wave peaks and the membrane vibrates with maximum displacement. Past it, the wave dies rapidly, its energy absorbed at the matching position. When you hear a friend's voice across a room, every frequency component in that voice, from the low hum of the vocal cords to the high sibilance of consonants, is being sorted to a different position along this membrane simultaneously, in real time, through physics that requires no neural computation and no conscious effort. Each frequency in a complex sound produces its peak at a specific, predictable position along the membrane. 20,000 Hz peaks at the stiff base. 20 Hz peaks at the flexible apex. Middle C, approximately 262 Hz, peaks roughly 20 millimeters from the base. A piano keyboard stretching the length of your little finger, with every key tuned to a specific position, every position tuned to a specific frequency, and every incoming sound striking multiple keys simultaneously. The membrane is a mechanical spectrum analyzer, decomposing complex waveforms into frequency components through physical resonance, no computation, no digital processing, pure mechanics, a stiffness gradient, fluid dynamics, and resonance performing the mathematical operation of Fourier analysis through the physics of a vibrating ribbon in a fluid-filled tube. Frequency separation is only half the problem. A vibrating membrane is something the brain cannot read. What converts the mechanical vibration at each position into an electrical signal the auditory nerve can carry. Sitting on the basilar membrane, approximately 15,000 outer hair cells and 3,500 inner hair cells arranged in rows running the full length of the cochlea. Each cell carries a bundle of stereocilia, microscopic hair-like projections arranged in a staircase of graded heights, connected at their tips by protein filaments called tip links. The two populations serve different functions. The inner hair cells are the true sensory transducers, converting mechanical motion into the electrical signals the brain receives. The outer hair cells are amplifiers. When they detect vibration, they physically change shape, contracting and elongating at the frequency of the incoming sound, mechanically boosting the basilar membrane's vibration at that position. The amplification increases the membrane sensitivity by a factor of approximately 100, allowing you to hear sounds that would otherwise fall below the detection threshold. When outer hair cells die, the amplification disappears before the transduction does. You lose sensitivity and clarity in that frequency band long before you lose the ability to detect it entirely. When the basilar membrane vibrates at a given position, the fluid motion deflects the stereocilia bundle at that position. The deflection pulls the tip links taut. The taut tip links physically open ion channels at the molecular scale, a transduction process, Hudspeth mapped in detail in neuron. Potassium ions from the potassium-rich fluid surrounding the cells flood through the open channels. The cell depolarizes. Calcium enters. Neurotransmitter releases onto the auditory nerve fiber. The nerve fires. The brain receives a signal carrying one piece of information. This frequency is present in the incoming sound, at this intensity, at this moment. Displacement of 0.3 nanometers opens the channel, the diameter of a single gold atom. Your ear's hair cells detect mechanical motion at the atomic scale, the most sensitive mechanical detectors in the human body. No instrument engineered by human hands approaches this sensitivity. The conversion from vibration to electrical signal happens through a protein gate that opens when pulled by a force measured in piconewtons on a structure measured in nanometers, in response to a pressure wave that traveled from the air through the eardrum through three tiny bones through the oval window into the cochlear fluid to arrive at this exact position on the membrane. The chain from airborne sound to neural signal passes through 6 mechanical stages before reaching a detector that operates at the boundary of what physics allows a biological structure to sense. Every stage amplifies or transforms the signal, and the final stage, the tip link pulling open the ion channel, converts mechanical energy to electrical energy through a gate that has been opening and closing at audio frequencies for your entire conscious life. A detector operating at the atomic scale is also the most fragile structure in the body, and the cells that house it carry a property that changes everything about what happens when they sustain damage. Mammalian cochlear hair cells do not regenerate. This is an evolutionary loss that separates mammals from nearly every other vertebrate class. Birds regenerate cochlear hair cells routinely. A songbird exposed to damaging noise recovers full hearing within weeks as new cells grow from supporting tissue in the cochlear epithelium. Fish regenerate them continuously throughout their lifespan. Amphibians regenerate them after injury. The genes for hair cell regeneration exist in the mammalian genome, conserved across hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary time, but they are silenced. The molecular pathway that would allow a supporting cell to divide and differentiate into a new hair cell is present in the genetic code of every cell in your cochlea. The pathway is switched off. The reasons for the silencing are debated, but the leading hypothesis is that mammalian hearing requires a level of structural precision in the cochlear mosaic that regeneration would disrupt. Each hair cell must be tuned to its exact position on the membrane, connected to the correct nerve fiber, oriented with its stereocilia bundle facing the correct direction. Regenerating a cell is simple. Regenerating it in the right place with the right connections and the right orientation is the problem evolution could not solve while maintaining the frequency precision mammals require for speech recognition, predator detection, and the auditory discrimination that separates a human voice from background noise across a crowded room. The cells laid down during fetal development are the total supply available for the remaining lifespan. Every cell lost is a permanent subtraction from a total that began at birth and has no mechanism for replenishment. How many have you lost? Well, the primary mechanism of hair cell death is noise exposure, and the physics of noise energy is where the cumulative damage becomes measurable. Sound intensity is proportional to pressure amplitude squared. The unit of measurement, the decibel, is logarithmic. which means the relationship between the numbers on the scale and the energy they represent is steeply nonlinear. Every 3 decibel increase represents a doubling of sound energy arriving at the cochlea. The numbers on the volume dial bear no intuitive relationship to the energy they deliver. The sustained damage threshold sits at approximately 85 decibels for prolonged exposure. A normal conversation measures approximately 60 decibels. A lawnmower measures approximately 90 decibels, 5 decibels above the threshold, which sounds like a modest increase but represents more than 3 times the energy of the threshold because each 3 decibel step doubles the energy. A rock concert at 110 decibels sits 25 decibels above the threshold, and because that doubling compounds with each step, those 25 decibels represent approximately 30,000 times the energy of the damaged threshold. 30,000 times the safe level applied to structures at the atomic scale for 2 to 3 hours of exposure. Headphones at maximum volume deliver a comparable load directly into the ear canal with no atmospheric attenuation. Power tools without ear protection deliver 90 to 110 decibels, hour after hour, year after year. The cumulative energy arriving at the basal hair cells that already absorbed the concert damage a decade earlier. That energy enters the cochlea and arrives at the stereocilia, the atomic scale projections connected by tip links that operate through Pike-Newton forces. Excessive sound energy physically breaks the stereocilia bundles. The tip links snap under forces they were never calibrated to sustain. The ion channels can no longer open because the mechanical linkage that opened them no longer exists. Without ion flux, the cell loses its signaling capacity entirely. Without signaling, the cell undergoes apoptosis, programmed cell death, dismantling itself and leaving a gap in the cochlear mosaic that will never be filled by a replacement. Every frequency that position was responsible for detecting disappears from the auditory input, permanently, irreversibly. The damage accumulates across decades and concentrates at specific positions. The base of the cochlea, where high frequencies resonate, receives the most energy because sound enters at the base first, and the traveling wave deposits its highest frequency energy at the earliest position it encounters. High-frequency hair cells are destroyed preferentially. This is why age-related and noise-related hearing loss begins with high frequencies, the region most exposed, earliest and longest. Each timeline is personal and traceable. The concerts at 20, standing near the speakers for 2 hours at 105 decibels, each event delivering thousands of times the damage threshold to the basal hair cells. The power tools at 35, the circular saw without ear protection, 95 decibels for an afternoon. The headphones at 40, the volume creeping upward over the years as the high-frequency cells thinned, and the compensation required to hear the original clarity increased, each increase delivering more energy to the cells that were already damaged. Each event breaking more stereocilia at the base, each loss subtracting another cell from a supply that started at 15,000 and has been declining ever since. Invisible for decades because the system has redundancy. When 10% of the hair cells at a frequency position are gone, the remaining 90% carry the signal. You hear the frequency. When 30% are gone, the signal weakens, but the brain compensates by increasing its sensitivity to the reduced input. You still hear the frequency, perhaps a little less distinctly in noisy environments. When 50 or 60% are gone, the signal drops below the threshold for reliable perception, and the audiologist's tone test reveals what has been accumulating silently for years: the high-frequency notch, the characteristic dip at 4,000 Hz that noise-induced hearing loss produces, the signature of decades of cumulative damage written into the audiogram. I listen to the pitch of my own tinnitus differently after learning this sequence. The frequency I hear every night is the specific note the cochlea lost and the cortex fills with a phantom. The sound carries a readout I never knew how to interpret until now. But what happens inside the brain when an entire frequency band goes silent? The ear has lost a note from its keyboard. The nerve fiber that carried that note has fallen silent. And the brain's response to that silence is the physics that nobody who hears the ringing has ever been told. The frequency is gone from the cochlea. The nerve fiber that carried it falls silent. The cortical neurons that processed it lose their input. And what the brain does next is what produces the sound you hear every night in the quiet of your bedroom. Your auditory cortex contains a tonotopic map, a physical layout where adjacent cortical regions process adjacent frequency bands, mirroring the basilar membrane's frequency to position arrangement. Low frequencies are processed at one end, high frequencies at the other, with the full audible spectrum arranged in an orderly gradient across the cortical surface. The map is maintained by continuous input from the cochlea, each cortical region receiving a steady stream of signals from its corresponding hair cell population. The map held in place by the signals that define it. The arrangement is precise enough that neuroscientists can predict which frequency a patient is hearing by observing which cortical region activates. When hair cells die in a frequency region, the corresponding cortical neurons stop receiving input. The neurons are deafferented, cut off from their designated signal source. The cortical territory that processed that frequency band, for example, goes dark. The signals that held the map in place at that position vanish. A strip of cortex that has processed one frequency for decades, that built its synaptic architecture around the specific timing and amplitude patterns of that frequency signal, suddenly receives nothing. The input stream it was designed to process terminates. What does a cortical region do when the signal it was built for disappears? Well, in most sensory systems, deafferented neurons gradually reduce their activity and go quiet, the cortical territory fading into functional silence as the input that sustained it disappears. In the auditory cortex, the deafferented neurons do the opposite. They begin firing spontaneously, generating electrical activity without any incoming signal from the ear. The firing rate increases above what it was when real signals were arriving. The neurons that spent decades processing a specific frequency, whose entire synaptic architecture was tuned to that frequency's characteristics, begin generating activity at the rate and pattern that frequency would have produced. Adjacent cortical regions, still receiving input from intact frequency bands, expand into the vacated territory, a process Egermont and Roberts documented in Trends in Neurosciences and named cortical remapping. The boundary between active and silent cortex shifts. Neurons that previously processed adjacent frequencies now occupy the vacated zone, and the overlapping activity patterns in the remapped territory produce a confused, persistent signal the brain's perceptual system interprets as sound, a tone at approximately the frequency that was lost. The deafferented neurons, firing spontaneously at the rate and pattern their lost input would have produced, generate a perception indistinguishable from real sound. Phantom limb sensation operates through the same cortical physics. After amputation, the somatosensory cortex that processed touch from the missing limb loses its input. The deafferented neurons begin firing spontaneously, and the patient feels the limb that no longer exists because the cortical representation is still active, generating sensation from nothing. The phantom limb is felt because the brain remembers the limb. Tinnitus is heard because the brain remembers the frequency. Both are perceptions generated by cortex that lost its input, and both persist because no sensory cortex evolved to interpret the permanent absence of a signal it was built to receive. Rauschecker and colleagues proposed a neuron that tinnitus persists in some people and remains below awareness in others because of a gating mechanism in the limbic system. The limbic system normally filters irrelevant neural signals below conscious perception, the filtering system that allows you to ignore the feeling of clothing on your skin or the sound of your own breathing. In people without clinically significant tinnitus, the brain successfully suppresses the spontaneous firing before it reaches awareness. The phantom is generated in the deafferented cortex, but caught by the gate before it reaches a conscious perception. In people with persistent tinnitus, the gating mechanism fails, and the phantom signal reaches conscious perception as a tone the listener cannot escape. The deafferented cortex generates the phantom in nearly everyone who has lost hair cells. Whether you hear it depends on whether the gate holds. At night, the gate fails. Now, the question you ask every night when the ringing becomes loudest: why is it worse in a quiet room? Signal-noise physics explains the pattern operating at the cortical level. The spontaneous firing in the deafferented cortex runs continuously, at roughly constant intensity, all day, every day. The phantom signal does not grow louder at night. It runs at approximately constant amplitude whether you are in a crowded restaurant or lying in bed. What changes is everything around it. During waking hours, environmental sound provides competing input across all frequency bands. Real signals from intact hair cells flood the auditory cortex with legitimate neural activity. The phantom signal is present but masked, drowned in the activity of real auditory processing, the way a candle flame is invisible in sunlight. You do not hear the ringing during a conversation because the conversation's neural signal overwhelms the phantom's neural signal at the cortical level. The ratio between real input and phantom firing is so heavily weighted toward real input during the day that the phantom never crosses the perceptual threshold. Every sound in the room, every voice, every air conditioner hum, every car passing outside, every ambient noise you would normally ignore contributes to the masking that keeps the phantom below awareness. The masking is not intentional. It is the natural consequence of a cortex processing real sound at a volume that buries the phantom signal beneath it. In a quiet room, especially at bedtime, the masking disappears. Real auditory input drops toward zero. The only signal remaining in the auditory cortex is the spontaneous firing in the deafferented zone. The phantom emerges above the perceptual threshold because everything else grew quieter. The signal itself never changed. The signal-to-noise ratio inverted. During the day, the real signal dominated and the phantom was noise. At night, the phantom dominates and the silence provides no competing signal. The ringing that appears to arrive in silence was running the entire time. The silence removed what was hiding it. This is why white noise machines, fans, and ambient sound reduce tinnitus perception. They provide masking input that pushes the spontaneous firing below the awareness threshold. The phantom is still present in the cortex. The competing sound prevents the brain from isolating the phantom signal against a silent background. The candle is still lit. The room is no longer dark enough to see it. Every phantom carries a frequency. Every frequency is a map. And then, the phantom has a specific pitch. That pitch carries information you have never been told. Tinnitus frequency corresponds to the basilar membrane position where hair cells were lost. The correspondence is precise enough to serve as a diagnostic tool. High-pitched tinnitus in the 4,000 to 8,000 Hz range, the most common presentation, maps to damage at the base of the cochlea, the region that absorbed the most cumulative noise energy across a lifetime. This frequency band corresponds to the bandwidth most vulnerable to concerts, power tools, headphones, and industrial noise accumulated across decades of exposure. If you hear a high-pitched ring, you are hearing the ghost of the frequency band that cumulative sound energy destroyed. The pitch is a diagnostic readout, a map of the acoustic damage the cochlea sustained across a lifetime, carried in your perception every time the room falls quiet. The audiologist's tone test will confirm what the tinnitus already told you. The dip on the audiogram and the pitch of the phantom occupy one frequency. Low-pitched tinnitus maps to damage further toward the apex, less commonly caused by noise, more often associated with age-related degeneration of the apical hair cells or abnormal fluid pressure in the cochlear chamber. The frequency you hear is the frequency you lost. The cortex remembers it with the precision of the tonotopic map that once processed it. The cochlea cannot play it. The phantom fills the space between the two. I matched mine to a tone generator one evening. 4,000 Hz, the base of the cochlea. The position that absorbed 30 years of headphone use and a decade of live music before I understood what the energy was doing to structures finer than a wavelength of light. The pitch was the map, and the map told me what I lost. Gone, the cells. Present, the phantom they left behind. What can be restored, and what cannot. Hair cells cannot be regenerated in humans with current medicine. Gene therapy research is in early stages, with laboratory work demonstrating that the silence regeneration pathway in mammalian cochlear tissue can be partially reactivated under controlled conditions. Clinical application remains years away, and the challenge extends beyond regrowing the cells. Each new cell would need to connect to the correct auditory nerve fiber, tune its mechanical properties to the specific frequency its basilar membrane position requires, and integrate into the existing cochlear architecture without disrupting the hair cells that survived. The cortical phantom cannot be directly silenced without affecting adjacent auditory processing, because the deafferented neurons share circuitry with neurons still receiving legitimate input from intact frequency bands. Suppressing the spontaneous firing in the deafferented zone risks suppressing real signal processing in the adjacent zones. What can shift is the perception, and the physics of why each intervention works traces back to the cortical remapping that created the phantom. Hearing aids that amplify real sound in the lost frequency range restore the input, the cortex was manufacturing a phantom to replace. The amplification boosts environmental sound in the specific frequency band where the hair cell loss occurred, delivering a real signal to the auditory nerve fibers that still connect to surviving cells in the damaged region. When real signal returns through amplification, even at reduced fidelity, the cortex receives input where it was receiving none. The phantom becomes partially redundant. The spontaneous firing in the deferented zone often decreases because the cortex no longer needs to generate a replacement for a signal that is now arriving, however weakly, from the cochlea. The hearing aid does not treat the tinnitus directly. It restores the input the brain was building from nothing, reducing the cortex's need to generate the phantom. Many people who receive hearing aids for age-related hearing loss report an unexpected reduction in tinnitus, because the tinnitus and the hearing loss share a common origin in the death of the same hair cells at the same cochlear position. Sound therapy operates through the masking physics the quiet room demonstrated in reverse. Adding sound raises the noise floor until the phantom falls below the perceptual boundary. Cognitive habituation operates through a different mechanism entirely. The brain's attention networks, specifically the prefrontal cortex and the connections between the auditory cortex and the limbic system, can learn to deprioritize the phantom signal through neuroplastic adaptation over months and years. The phantom remains present in the cortex. The brain's allocation of attention to it diminishes. The sound does not change. The weight the mind assigns to it does. The process is gradual, measured in months rather than days, and it depends on the gating mechanism Rauschketter described, the limbic system, learning to filter the phantom below awareness, restoring the gate the tinnitus represents the failure of the hair cells are gone. The cortex remembers what they heard. The sound that nothing is making is the brain, remembering a note the ear can no longer play.